her opinion is Scarlett Mccgwire, who's a former Labour advisor. Scarlett, do you think the Labour Party have grounds to be worried about either of these candidates?
We had some people shouting from one of the windows.
Both of them are so easy to beat. I mean, you've got Rishi Sunak, who's put up taxes, who is now sort of thinking about what he should be doing, and actually has lost an awful lot of credibility. And then you've got Liz Truss, who, I mean, you said it.
Oh, we seem to have lost Scarlett's audio there. Let's try and get her back. But thankfully, I have a studio guest to fill in the gaps, Charlie Peters. Charlie, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that in the wake of Boris, it feels like everyone's a little bit humdrum and underwhelming, and yet they're both so different. You've got sort of, character Hans Sunak with his toothsome grin and his hyper energy promising us, well, essentially not cutting taxes. And then Liz Truss, who's basically got the drop-down menu of everything that the right wing of the Conservative Party would want, and yet the packaging just seems so.
I think you're making Rishi Sunak sound a little bit more exciting than he actually is. There, I think it's more kind of David Brent Sunak. Some of the clips coming out of his camp of him reacting to the votes, it's mildly cringe-inducing. But he certainly is, I think, more appealing across the country versus the kind of hard Toryism of Liz Truss. But we just heard from Scarlett there in the intro of her interrupted speech about how these two candidates both will be easy to beat for Labour. They're the dream candidates for Labour. I'm not entirely convinced by that. Just when we think about what's coming up next, when this election is done, the autumn is going to bring enormous amounts of economic pain. And generally speaking, we find that in hard times, in economic hardship, voters tend to prefer the blue team. They don't usually look to Labour when the economy is struggling and financial situations in households are tough.
Well, Scarlett, who we have managed to get back, or at least got her audio back, I'm going to put that to you because Charlie makes a point there that's become a bit of a familiar trope in politics, hasn't it? When we face economic hardship, voters trust the Conservatives more to look after the country's money than they do the Labour Party. So on that, considering the big tug of war seems to be whether or not to push for growth by cutting taxes and risk increasing inflation, or to play it super safe as banker Sunak wants to do, which side do you come down on?
I mean, neither, because I think the problem with Rishi is the national insurance rise. Is that when he had a chance of actually putting more money into the health service, he chose the wrong one, and he really punished people who are at work. And that actually will not be forgiven. I mean, he might now say, I'll do this and I'll do that. But the problem with Liz Truss is growth. It's like it's a magic word. It's like saying, we're going to do this by making things more efficient. We're going to do things with growth. I mean, she is economically illiterate. And I mean, for the sake of the country, it should be Rishi to get it, because I do worry about what's going to happen, actually, if Liz Truss wins.
Stay there, Scarlett. But Charlie, do you agree with that? I was listening to some interesting interviews earlier with economists, and at the end of the day, the economy or understanding it is a bit of an art form. And there are people out there going, well, no, Liz Truss might actually have a point. Depending on what you cut, how you cut, it doesn't necessarily spike inflation. And potentially her model is based on this idea that we're going into a recession. Mm-hmm. Where do you stand on this? Who's got the right recipe?
I think Scarlett was underestimating the problems with Rishi Sunak. It's not just the national insurance hike, which I think is a deeply poor misstep that he took there. But I think fundamentally he doesn't believe in economic growth. He's a manager for decline. He's overseeing being captured by the Treasury and not really wanting to push in that growth that Liz Truss and other Tories are trying to bring. I mean, Scarlett derides economic growth, describing it as a magic word, growth. But that's how we pay for all the things that we need. This country hasn't grown economically in a long time. We are in a state of financial stagnation, and it would be lovely, I think, it would be brilliant to have a Conservative, or at least a Conservative cabinet, that believes in economic growth as one of its first principles. This is urgently needed.
Yeah, and Scarlett, going back to you, let's park the economy to one side. It's all we tend to hear about at the moment. There are plenty of other things going on in the world. There's the constant chatter about what's going on socially, woke versus anti-woke. There's, of course, huge decisions to be made when it comes to foreign policy. Out of Sunak and Truss, who's got the most capable pair of hands for looking after the other elements of our national interest?
I mean, I think if you look at the electorate as a whole, and even the Conservative electorate, woke and anti-woke actually isn't a big deal. I think foreign policy is massive. We know nothing about Rishi Sunak and foreign policy. What we know about Liz Truss is she wants to be Margaret Thatcher. I mean, Liz Truss. All these people who say that Rishi Sunak has betrayed Boris because he's been planning his election campaign, Liz Truss has been on manoeuvres since she got in as foreign policy, as secretary as foreign secretary. I mean, there is no question. Her pictures of the a la Mrs. Thatcher in the tank. Liz Truss is absolutely going, and what she wants. I mean. What she will certainly be supporting the Ukrainians. She'll be certainly supporting the war. Whether she'll actually be saying, what do we want at the end of this, apart from Vladimir Putin to have a bloody face, I don't know. And that what I'm worried about is there are no nuances to her. Is she just sort of, I mean, she's like a tank. She just goes on.
Yeah, Charlie, finally back to you. I mean, Scarlett does have a point there. For a foreign secretary, thankfully, she doesn't have a massive international profile because on 2 occasions, she's had to be corrected by Downing Street or the Minister of Defence. First of all, when she suggested that indeed Brits should go out and help the war effort in Ukraine and fight on the ground. And then talking about pre-arming Taiwan, essentially really poking the Beijing bear.
Yes. I think this is a part of a broader problem that Liz Truss has, which is she's not a particularly competent media performer. Often she says things she doesn't mean, and she's quite wooden, and I just don't know, a little bit weird on camera, I think. It doesn't make me feel comfortable watching her. And I think perhaps, and I can't read into this too much, but often it feels as though when Liz Truss is on camera, she might say 1 or 2 incorrect things just to kind of move things along, which just feels like a kind of a natural impulse. But I want to take it back quickly to the comment we heard before from Scarlett about how woke and anti-woke isn't particularly important in the electorate. I think it matters enormously in the Conservative Party, who are going to choose the next Prime Minister. I think the members in the Conservative Party, when they were surveyed by Conservative Home who they wanted to be the next Prime Minister, they overwhelmingly looked towards Kemi Badenoch, who opened a double-digit lead over the nearest competitor. And that was because, I think, Kemi was positioning herself as the culture war candidate. Members, and I think lots of people across the country, recognise that these vast changes to social issues and the structure of our country in our institutions has an enormous effect on our way of life, and it's important to fight on it.
Charlie, thank you ever so much. Scarlett Mccgwire, wonderful to have you back on the programme as well. Always lovely talking to you.